Okay, welcome everybody. We're so excited that you're all here. I'm Nancy Dowling. I'm the chair of the Democratic Committee for Bristol. And this is our second large group meeting. And we're so happy to have Steve Marchand. I've heard him speak before at a conference, and he's amazing. He's been very active politically for a long time in New Hampshire. He was the mayor of Portsmouth. He ran for governor. He was a candidate for governor. And then how many years ago did you find Move the Goalposts?
About 4 years ago.
He found an organization called Move the Goalposts 4 years ago, and it focuses on helping Democrats in New Hampshire win down ballot races. He's here to tell us about District 18, which is the district we all live in, which is a big district. And it's one of the most important House races in New Hampshire, and we can win this. We're sure we can win this with all of us working, of course. And Bristol's right in the heart of this. So I'm gonna let him explain the techie part of it, because people are zooming in from all over our district
and beyond.
And beyond.
And beyond.
And beyond. So he'll let you people hear how you can access some of the information. So welcome.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, everybody can hear me okay? Right. Good. Thanks for coming out this evening. It is not hyperbole that we are currently in one of the handful of most important House districts, even in a House of 400 members. How could any one of them be that important? But the reality is, it was basically a 202 to 198 Republican House at the end of last cycle. And one of the races was decided by, out of almost 8,500, 4 votes, and you are in it. And this is where, as you mentioned, Move the Goalposts, I appreciate the intro. It's really focused on marginal benefit, marginal cost, marginal benefit. If you have $25, or if you have a half a day on a weekend to spare to knock on doors in a community or a district, where would be the places where that $25, that would seem like a drop in an ocean of a presidential, Senate, or gubernatorial race, where would it actually make the greatest marginal difference in what is, frankly, a really important goal? Getting control and keeping control of the New Hampshire House, New Hampshire Senate, and the Executive Council. That's what I mean by down ballot state races. It's not that the top of the ticket doesn't matter. It sure does. But as you probably have noticed, when people say my $25 contribution or my 4 hours of time to knock in October feels so small, a drop in an ocean in these large scale races, it does mean something. But I don't know how many times I've met friends who run for the legislature and they wish they had that extra half a day of your time on a Saturday or Sunday coming down the stretch. And when we have races decided by 4, we had a race that was tied in Rochester, a ward of Rochester. It was a tie. And then 2 months later, we had another special election. And then that one we won, which got us to 198. So this is going to be extremely close again. And we're going to talk a little bit about why that is. Before going any further, I realized, and it is my fault, I failed to mention early on that I would have some slides that could really animate some of the concepts. So we don't have it up here, but if you have your phone, what you could do, and I think the most efficient way to get this done, if you were to receive the link to be able to register, and then you just mute your phone, you'll get a link back, and then if you mute your phone, you'll be able to look at the slides basically on the comfort of your cell phone. Now the question is getting you the link.
And Wi-Fi is TOP public, so if you're looking for Wi-Fi.
Okay, so we could do that part. Let's see. I don't know if Ann, if you could hear me. You provided me the link.
Yeah.
Let's see here. Do we have any? Does anybody here have many of the emails of folks that maybe registered in advance of tonight? That kind of thing.
So are you looking for the link just to get on?
So folks could join in here in person and be able to see the slides.
Yeah, but I can send it to you, but how do you send it to them?
I would need your email address.
That might take a while.
That might take a while. Yes.
Can you airdrop a link?
Can we airdrop a link?
Well, let me send it to Tom because I've got him in here. He's in the message. And I'll send it to Paul. He's on
Okay.
there.
We're gonna put the pressure on your ability to explain.
Yeah, this is kind of like playing Pictionary with the video not working on the TV. I believe she is.
Who's she? Is that me?
Oh, yes. Sorry. I think Ann is sending.
I sent it through the chat. What do you want me to do? Send it through?
Oh, to Tom's email.
Okay. Well, I sent it to his chat, his message.
Oh, okay.
I'll send it to Paul Bemis' message on his phone.
Okay.
I'll send it to
Okay,
Steve
good.
Marchand on his phone.
So I'll get going. You won't need the slides early on, so you won't lose any of that. But if there would be a way to maybe get some of your email addresses, and maybe we could give that opportunity to you. I don't want to delay too much longer here.
If you can send me an email, opaltp@gmail.com. And I'll reply.
I'll spell that out for folks just to be sure. That second vowel could be a doozy.
What?
Spell it out.
Yeah, so it's opaltp. O is in Oscar, P is in Papa, B is in Papa again, E Echo L Lima, T Tango, P Papa.
Wow. I feel like we were sharing military secrets. Oh, of course we are, yes.
opaltp@gmail.com.
Okay, and with that, we'll get going, and soon enough, you will join us visually, but you're here already, so that's a great start. Okay, so tonight's agenda, I'm going to briefly go over the 2024 playing field. So we all, when we're running for office or we're helping people who are, we're doing it in a context, and that context matters a lot. Over the 20 years, I've been looking at this stuff in various ways. Before I ran for governor, much earlier, I was a very young mayor. And even before that, I was running races. I ran a governor's race, congressional, presidential, state senate, all that stuff. So I'm wearing a different hat, but it's all in the same section of hats in the store. And it matters a lot. And one of the key things we find is that the top of the ticket, particularly the governor's race, which we'll get into more in a moment, plays a dominant role in creating the political environment in which all the down ballot candidates run. When you run with a gubernatorial candidate who is doing well in the general election, it is like having the wind at your back. And when the opposite happens, well, the wind is also moving in your face. It's moving in the opposite direction. That's the presidential matters. When we have a US Senate race, it matters. We don't this time. But the gubernatorial race is the most influential. It's causal. It's not just a correlation. It really is causal. We'll talk about Grafton 18. There are 10 towns here. It is, as you probably know, a sprawling district. And that's how you can have almost 8,500 votes in an off-year election. And that's how, and then again, decided by only 4 on a recount. And then I've been doing presentations along these lines dozens and dozens of times over the last year. But I have some new stuff tonight that provides you risk and reward. The reward is, hopefully you'll find some new insight very helpful. I was kind of excited by some of the stuff I was working on. The risk is, among other things, typos, because I was finishing it up shortly before driving here tonight. And then it's Q&A and discussion along the way. Please feel free to jump in, raise your hand, and what I'll do is I'll repeat your question or comment as succinctly as I can, so that folks listening in on Zoom can hear it and then know what we're talking about. Probably the single most important metric, analytical tool that I have, that I use and will refer to several times tonight, is called the Partisan Voter Index, the PVI. There are versions kind of like this, the Cook Political Report, if you like the national stuff, political junkies. They have a version of this. The state party uses a version of this. Mine is different in some important ways because they focus on down ballot races. And like I said, so what it does is it answers the following question. How much more Republican or Democratic is your town, or in this case, your district, in statewide general elections compared to the state in the same statewide general elections. So when I say that a district is D+2, that means that in recent general elections involving the president, US Senate, and governor, the statewide elections, general election, it does around 2 points better for the Democrats than the state does overall in those same races. And it turns out over 20 years, because we have so many state rep races, we have a tremendous amount of data. So we have 400 state rep races in effect every 2 years. So when you do this for 20 years in different forms, that's literally thousands of data points that create some real patterns that have proven to be very predictive rather, and durable. These trends move that we'll talk about tonight, but they move slowly and they move over time, almost like tectonic plates under your feet, that you don't really notice demographic and political trends moving until one day they moved enough that bang, you get an earthquake. And you could argue that 2016 was the last time that we had something like an earthquake. It certainly was disruptive like an earthquake. And that was the accumulation of years of different segments of the two parties' bases slowly moving towards one and away from the other. And finally, there was just enough movement in different directions that it created new coalitions able to eke out elections. A lot of those demographic trends have accelerated, and there are new ones that have also begun occurring in the last 8 years. So the number to keep in mind is that over the last 8 years of statewide general elections, Democrats have gotten an average of about 48.6% of the general election two-party vote. So I take out libertarian, independent, apples to apples. 48.6. Why is it not 50? More than 50. Basically, we have gotten to the place where we win federal races with great regularity, sometimes by a little, sometimes by a lot. But we've struggled in gubernatorial races. And like I mentioned earlier, those are the ones that have more direct relationship with down ballot performance than US Senate or president. So I weigh the governor's race a little more heavily in my numbers than some of the others that the state party and Cook Political Report do, because I care about the down ballot and we've identified that relationship. So, like I said, if I say R+2 in the next few minutes, that means the district or the town is acting about 2 points more Republican in those statewide elections than the state overall. What I found over about 20 years, and it's remarkable how predictive this ends up being, districts that are between the threes, D+3 down to 0 to R+3, are incredibly swingy. I can give you tons of examples every cycle of a Republican winning a D+2 House seat or a Democrat winning an R+3. Many of them, dozens in some cycles. To the sixes, so spread it out to a little bit more partisan. I can give you some examples every cycle, but once they start getting outside of about R3 or D3 out to 4, 5, 6, it starts whittling down. It becomes much more partisan in its results, which makes sense when you think about it. An R+6 means it's 6 points more Republican than a 48.6 baseline, which means that would be the average Democrat is getting 42.6. So that means if a down ballot Democrat is winning in a district that's an R+6, they're overcoming a lot of structural disadvantages, and it happens. And when it does happen, there's usually some really good reasons. Some of the work has allowed me to identify common characteristics of candidates that tend to over or underperform in various kinds of races. So there's a lot of caveats to it, but retired school teachers, retired firefighters and police officers, people that have been really successful at winning nonpartisan local elections that then try to run in a similar area because they do well. And it makes sense because people generally either have great respect for the professions and or if they got elected, they got used to the idea of voting for Mary Smith and then included Republicans who did not see her in a partisan light. These elections locally are nonpartisan. The greatest predictor of future behavior is past behavior. And when the past behavior was, I voted for Mary Smith because I didn't know if she was a Democrat. I just knew she was a good school board member. Now you elevate it and say, I'm going to run for a partisan office And what you find very quickly is they go, still the same old Mary Smith I voted for before. And that's really powerful. And you can overcome disadvantages very quickly. So for those that are able to, you may see this, otherwise I may come back to it if a few others do. There are 10 towns in this district. It is one of the bigger districts in the state, certainly when you get south of Coos County and a few other places, in terms of the number of towns in this flotarial district. I don't know if folks are familiar with what a flotarial is compared to a regular. So a regular district is the one you would have seen on TV, Schoolhouse Rock, where the law says that you have to have a roughly certain number of voters per seat. And it changes based on the population. We have 400. That number's the same. We divide it in, and that's about how many, and you have a certain margin for error. Well, the thing is that in these towns, sometimes there's not an easy way to add them up to keep it within the percentage of the exact number. So they take the extra in multiple towns, sometimes 10 towns, like this one, and they get it so that it adds up to another seat. So basically, just to use simple numbers, if the average seat should have about 4,000 residents attached to it, this district would have roughly the sum of the 4,000 kind of extra, couple hundred in Enfield, couple hundred in Grafton, and you get the idea, Bristol and so forth, and it adds up to roughly one extra seat. And what it means on your ballot is, say in Bristol, actually every one of these 10 towns, you have one rep that is not flotarial. They are the regular one for a subset of the towns, including your town. And then a flotarial on a separate line, that will be your rep for that whole big district we're talking about tonight. So they're separate elections. They're not running against each other. They're running on the same ballot, and they call it a flotarial.
But does that mean we have 2 representatives?
It does, and it's kind of quirky. And one of the things that we find that we won't worry about too much tonight, because luckily every district, both this one, District 18, the overlap, the flotarial, as well as the 3 House districts that have their own seat that make it up in the towns, they all are single seat districts. And it means that people vote in those at about the same frequency that they vote for president and governor and US Senate. About 95 to 98% of people that walk in the voting booth will vote all the way down, including for state rep. But if you're in one of the districts that has multiple seats, like many do, it gets really weird really quick. And what we find is about an 8 to 10% drop off in participation in multi-seat House districts. And that actually, again, it doesn't apply here, but in places where it does, if we as Democrats could figure out how to capture some of those people that kind of get lost, that drop out because they see, vote for no more than 4, or in Derry, vote for no more than 10. And they go, A, I've never heard of such a thing. B, I don't even know 10 people here. And I got to vote for 10 of them? They're exhausted. And they're afraid that they may spoil their vote by voting for too many or something. And thus, the stuff they know about, like president and governor, they're going to spoil the whole ballot, they fear. It wouldn't be accurate, but that's what they're afraid of. And they're not irrational. It's a rational concern. So we see a big drop off. Luckily here, we don't. People vote in Carolyn's race in 2022, District 18, at virtually the same percentage that they do for governor and president and Senate and Congress, like 95 to 98%. In fact, in some races, a higher percentage of people voted in Carolyn's race than voted for governor last time, by a couple tenths of a point. So we do not have a drop off in these single seat districts, which is good, because that would otherwise be a whole sort of strategic discussion to have later. But this is a district made up of, it is not a bunch of purples, okay? This district, I mentioned, the PBI, this district is about 1.3, R 1.3. And that makes it one of the most competitive in the state, because it's close to dead even. Better news, it is slowly floating towards Democrats. It moved a tenth of a point towards Democrats in the last 2 years. So it's getting friendlier. So why is that? Well, here's the bottom line. Even though there's 10 towns in the district, most of the district lives in 3 towns: Enfield, Canaan, and Bristol. So Enfield is a quarter of the district, and it's D plus 10.5. It's one of the more democratic, I mean, forget like Hanover, Keene, Durham, like, People's Republic kind of stuff. When you get past the big 5 or 6, like super duper blue, Enfield kind of really stands out as one of the bluer communities among smaller communities, really in the entire state. And that's great because it's growing, it's getting bluer. It moved 1/5 of a point in the last 2 years towards Democrats. So it was already super blue, it's getting bluer. And it's a quarter of the district and slowly becoming bigger and bigger. So this is obviously very good news, but we'll get into what we have to do to maximize the benefit of that. The second biggest town is Canaan. Canaan is a little under 1/5 of the district. Canaan is moving, as you know, in a Democratic direction very quickly. Right now it's D3.5, but it moved more than 1/3 of a point towards Democrats in one election cycle. That's very fast. Anything more than 1/4 of a point a cycle is pretty fast. Yes?
When you do all this data, do you also try to assess why that's happening?
Yes. The short answer, we'll get more into it in a moment. The headline answer is, and it's not the only part, but it's demography. It used to be that the greatest predictor of whether a voter in New Hampshire or anywhere was going to vote Democrat or Republican was their race. If you told me if I could only know one thing and then I had to bet $1 on whether they tended to vote D or R, if you told me race, that would be the easiest way to come out ahead at the end of the night of dollar bets. That is no longer really true. It's now educational attainment and its closely related cousin, income, household income. We are dividing so quickly, and it has a lot of spin-off effects. The more formal education in the household, the more likely they are to be a Democrat. If you go back to the Reagan Revolution, this was not true. The reason the suburbs are moving towards Democrats very quickly is generally because the suburbs tend to have more higher income people who tended to have more higher levels of education. And that was the backbone of the Reagan Revolution in the 80 and 84 elections. A place like Bedford was as red as any place in New Hampshire. Well, now Bedford has 2 Democratic state reps and has a real chance to pick off a 3rd one this year. Unimaginable 15 years ago. But it's not because all these Democrats moved to Bedford, although some did. It's because a lot of the kind of people that were living in Bedford were floating away from the Republican Party over time and towards the Democratic Party. Trump did not cause this. Trump accelerated it. I know this because I'm married to a really good example. My wife volunteered for the Bush-Cheney 04 ticket. Love is stronger than partisanship. I will tell you, in college, I wanted to be a sportscaster, and I dated the girl at Syracuse who wanted to be a sportscaster, and she is, she's fantastic. And we dated for a long time. And she had a Don Mattingly Yankees poster on her wall. The relationship did not last. The Red Sox Yankee thing is definitely more powerful in a negative way than partisan, and that should give you hope about politics. Winning some World Series didn't change that either. So anyway, but the blue collar towns are doing the same thing in the opposite direction. A place like Claremont, Rochester, most of Coos County, certain blue collar wards of Manchester or Nashua, even Dover, even Portsmouth. It doesn't mean that they're Republican yet, but it means that they're not as democratic as they used to be. And a lot of that has a Catholic element to it. In New Hampshire, we don't really have a lot of non-white people, but we do have a lot of immigrant, like me. I'm a dual citizen. My folks are from Quebec. French was the first language in the house. They loved Bill Clinton. They became naturalized citizens. They voted for Barack Obama in 08. In 16, they liked Bernie. When Bernie didn't win, they voted for Trump. Then in 20, they definitely voted for Trump. They liked Yang, and then they stuck with Trump. And then in 24, they've been all in the whole time. And these, they're awesome people. I'll vouch for them. And great people can disagree on this stuff, but they are a great example of the shift that's occurring. Suburban, like my wife went from Bush-Cheney 04 volunteer to, she can't wait for Amy Klobuchar to run again. She loves Buttigieg. She's voting for Biden you're like, let's go. But then my parents went from Bill Clinton, Barack Obama, Bernie Sanders to where's my Trump sign? This is happening all over America, including people you know and love. So it's really important, I think, in the discussion, and we're going to get into this in a minute with some of the new material I've got, about understanding where people, including people that are still registered Democrats, are really looking at the world very differently than, I would argue, many people that would show up on a late June weeknight in Bristol to do this. We are probably not looking at the world quite the same way as a lot of other people that are registered Democrats. And that's where the real challenge is for us. And it's part of how we go from losing by 4 votes to winning by enough that you don't have to sweat it out on election night. There's a lot of margin there. So Canaan is the second biggest town, and it's moving quickly. It's marginally Democratic, but moving quickly towards us. And then the third biggest one is Bristol. Bristol is moving very quickly towards Democrats, but it remains pretty Republican. So it's R6.8, but it moved half a point in the last 2 years. That's a really big number. So it's coming, it's coming. But the good news is those 3 towns together make up, let's do some math, about over 60% of the entire district. So when I tell you that the 60% of the district is in basically a D plus 10.5, a D plus 3.5, and an R plus 6.8, but it's moving quickly towards us. Well, this is why the district overall is coming towards us pretty quickly, because the rest of the district, Alexandria, Bridgewater, Grafton, those are all pretty sturdy red towns. They're all moving towards Republicans, but they're a lot smaller. Those 3 together are almost exactly the same as Enfield. But Enfield is bluer than those 3 put together are red. So you see how the math is coming towards us. And then Hebron is moving as fast as any town in New Hampshire towards Democrats. It moved 1.1 points towards Democrats just in the last cycle. That's extremely fast. And it's moving from an R10 to an R9. I mean, it's galloping, but it still remains very red. Groton is small, it's incredibly red. Dorchester is really red, but moving blue, but it's so small. If the right couple of families move into town, we're in business. And then Orange is super small and is actually probably the most neutral politically in the entire district. It's an R3 and kind of hanging there. But that's the district. So one takeaway right out of the chute is, even though Enfield is super blue and is awesome, we need to max it out. So as you'll see in a few minutes, it's not just relying on the good people of Enfield to come out and do what they probably do. It's wringing out those extra, could be anything from several dozen to an extra 100 Democratic down ballot votes that are sitting there for us if we just do a few things to wring them out. But they're already there. Canaan is the same thing, but Enfield's so much bigger. That's really where so much of the low-hanging fruit is in this district. Just briefly, here's the political playing field I mentioned is this for the House. 400 seats, about 240 of them lean red with the PVI, some by a 100th of a point, some by 12 points. There are no red Hanovers. So Hanover is D plus 33. It's pretty amazing. But there are, to put it in perspective, we have 33 seats out of 400 are at least D plus 15 or more. Think of the places I was listing before. It would be a historic, if we ever lose one of those seats, you should move. Because it means that we've lost everything. Don't move, because we're going to need you a lot to help us at that point. But you know how many Republican seats are 15 or greater? 0. So the map, which unfortunately I have the chart here, one thing is the distribution of the partisanship of the seats is not the same. Democrats have more seats that are either really close to 0, in other words, very light blue, or way, way out, super dark blue. Republicans have a much bigger bump in the middle, R plus 5, R plus 4, R plus 6. Those are seats that are obviously, they're favored in, and in a Republican year, they're going to win those seats. In a neutral year, they're going to win most of those seats. In a Democratic year, we can do a lot of damage. And in 2022, we were making real inroads into that level of Republicanness, which is good because I mentioned out of 400, they have 240. So that means for us to get the majority, we have to basically run the table on the Democratic seats. And then we have to go 30 or 40 seats into Republican territory to get to the 201st friendliest seat. And by the way, right at this moment, this seat, D18, would be the 190th friendliest seat based on its PVI. Then when you add the fact that we have a candidate that nearly won, is back at it, and feel great about Carolyn, that we have new committees. I mean, one thing I've been able to see, what are the characteristics of towns and districts that improve? Candidates that run a second time typically learn a lot from the first time. Their name ID goes up a little bit because people saw their name. You know? Town committees formed help in lots of tangible and intangible ways. And important point, it's 190, but it's getting bluer. So it was 196 last cycle. So it's getting friendlier, which in my current estimation makes it about the 6th best flip opportunity in New Hampshire. Which, I mean, that means we're here tonight. We were here last Thursday talking to Carolyn. I'll be back. People will be back. Because if we want to win the House, there are a handful of seats here in Grafton that we need to flip. And a few others. Tom is running in a district that is blue, but not super duper blue. It's getting there. And yet, but we have to protect our turf in the light blue. And we have to find some opportunities to grab a few. I mean, that's bottom line, that's the job. Let's see. Okay, so there are 3 trend lines for the night. Now we're going to dig right into D18 for real. There are 3 trend lines that we can really consider in 2024. These are the factors that are going to impact all the work that candidates and their teams and their supporters and volunteers do. The first one we've already touched on a little bit from your question. Educational attainment and income have become the best predictor of voting behavior. So there are things we can do to nudge things along or to push back on trends if they're going the wrong way. But it would be disingenuous for me to say that we can ignore them or that they are not these huge factors that you will feel either at your back or your face, depending what community you're in. These are real factors and we need to acknowledge them. So what I was saying before, for example, the suburban towns are galloping towards us. There aren't a lot of towns here that I would classify certainly as classically suburban, the way that like a Bedford or a Goffstown or towards the seacoast like a Stratham.
Hey, Steve, just to interrupt, I don't think the folks are seeing your slides.
On Zoom or here?
Well, I'm looking on Zoom, and people are asking if it's still on the first slide. It's still on the title slide.
Oh, okay.
I'll try to fix it. Just keep going.
Oh, sure, yeah.
Sorry to interrupt.
Oh, so no, that's great. No, so we don't have a lot of that. In some ways, Enfield may be. Oh, good. Okay. In some ways, Enfield may be the best example because it's pretty clearly in the sphere of influence of the Upper Valley, and so that's what we're seeing across New Hampshire and the country. Is super blue cities become too expensive for many people who then wanting to live, work, retire, so forth in the area will begin spreading out, and you can see the lag effect of their political behavior as they pull out. So, for example, Carroll County, North Conway has become a super blue place, but a large part of the southern part of Carroll County is still pretty red, except for now you're seeing towns like Albany and Madison and Tamworth, and you can see it like clockwork. It's a real estate thing. They're creeping down, almost like blood kind of dripping into the surrounding towns. And we see that in the cities. That may not have sounded great. Kool-Aid. So in Manchester, we're seeing that there's like Goffstown and Bedford. Portsmouth is too expensive for pretty much anybody. And so we too have moved to Northampton. But Northampton, after living in Portsmouth 20 years, Northampton has gone from a pretty reliably Republican town to it's now a D+1. And that is because of real estate. But as I said earlier, the blue collar communities are moving away. And there are some examples, I think, in this district of some of the rural towns that are super red and are moving further in a red direction. There's a bit of a free state element in a couple of small towns here. There's some unique characteristics of every district. But when I think of a place like Grafton, that's probably a pretty good example. But like up near Berlin, I mentioned Claremont, Rochester, Winchester, and southwestern New Hampshire. These are the blue collar towns that are moving very quickly away. This is a big part of why Trump won in 2016. If you look at Michigan and Pennsylvania, if you look at how Ohio has sort of gone away from us, Wisconsin, these have a lot of communities that are blue collar, have experienced very difficult times. We're very open to moving to a Republican. And in those cases, Trump actually is accelerating it because his message is an excellent fit to connect emotively with where people there are looking for something new. And he provided pretty darn near exactly what they were looking for. My parents, again, are a good example of that. So that's the first one, socioeconomics, your income and your educational attainment. Here's the second one. And I alluded to this earlier. The single biggest factor that will influence the results of down ballot candidates will be the performance of our gubernatorial nominee. Okay? In some ways, it's the most important thing to remember because the fact you're here tonight, I've run for governor and I've managed governor's races, so I feel qualified to say this. Right now, Cindy and Joyce, and I don't have a dog in the fight, whoever the nominee is, count me in, right? They hunger for this room because in what will be a relatively low turnout primary, as all September primaries pretty much are, getting 15, 25, 50, oh, more than 50, oh my God, people in a room who would fit the profile of likely Democratic primary voters is gold. Because after the primary, the winner has to assume we're all going to be with the winner, and they should not be in this room after the primary, right? They need to be talking to people that would never show up in this room. But right now, please don't tell me who, but raise your hand if you feel like, yes, I've decided who I am voting for in the primary for governor. About half. That number is slowly going up over the months. It used to be less than a fifth, and now it's around a half or so. Frankly, it seems pretty split when people come up after. I specifically don't want to know. I think they're very similar, historically speaking. When I ran, it was a young guy versus an older woman. Policies were pretty different. Geography was different. Style was very different. There was a lot to choose from, and clearly folks like the other choice better, but that's a different conversation. Of course. Oh, yes.
And the powers that be in the Democratic power base in New Hampshire lined up behind that other candidate way before the primary. And I'm an independent, but I think the Democrats do themselves a lot of disservice when the powers that be, whether it's the senators or governor at the time, line up behind the candidate before a primary. Your race was a really good example of that, I felt.
I thought that too, but it's not illegal, you know.
How many ways can they shoot themselves in the foot?
I will say this. One thing from our own polling, and I keep this in mind going forward for all races, political races, is when we did the polling, we found that pretty much anybody who would have supported my opponent in a general election would have also supported me. But there were a lot of people the other way around, particularly men. And particularly French-Canadian men, which is still about a fifth of the state, and we've never had a French-Canadian governor. So we specifically wanted, my sign had a fleur-de-lis on it, and it wasn't a coincidence. We realized that there was, when you boiled it down, between 7 and about 12% of voters who effectively said, I'm not interested in voting for my opponent if she's the nominee, because she doesn't look anything like us, they felt there was disdain. Frankly, they feel the Democratic Party holds people like my forefathers in disdain. Most don't have a college degree. My dad was a carpenter. French is the first language of the home. You know, dad went to 8th grade. My mom got her GED. She worked in the mills in Manchester. I mean, the definition of blue collar. They feel like the party has left them because most French Canadians of a certain age were Democrats. They had John Kennedy on the wall, not unlike, Irish Americans did. All French Canadians by law begin as Catholic, and then they can decide later. But I mean, it was hardcore, and so they're like, look, I was looking to codify abortion rights before anybody else. I wanted to legalize cannabis before any other candidate did. I was pretty liberal on a lot of policies, but they're like, yeah. But look at them. And I will say that with Kelly, who I've known for almost 20 years, Kelly AI, she enjoys, in a different way, some similar benefits to what somebody with my profile would have enjoyed in 18, in that people begin with an assumption, for example, that if a woman is the nominee as a Republican, they're probably relatively moderate. Just as when they see a guy who's a Democrat, they begin, not by 20 points, but by enough that it matters, that the guy's probably relatively moderate. And it's not fair, maybe, and it's not accurate many times, obviously. But if you're beginning with presuppositions of a candidate, of a voter, from a voter, you have to work really hard to move a voter, because they're not thinking about this very long. They're thinking about this for seconds, and then they're going to make a decision at the end. So if they lock in presuppositions about a candidate, for better or worse, now you're spending time, you're spending money, you're spending energy, focus. These are so valuable things. And, you should try to leverage those sort of things to your advantage as a party, particularly in coin flip elections. So anyway, it does happen. But I learned a lot from it. But nonetheless, if you haven't decided, as I have not, my only thing I would urge you, they're very similar on policy, very similar in many ways. Decide who you think will give Kelly Ayotte a better run and vote for that person, because that's the only thing that matters. That's the only thing that matters, because there's no big policy difference that would could matter a lot between the two Democrats. And then you just got to go, because if we don't succeed at the gubernatorial level, we're asking Carolyn to get extra votes on her own. And I don't want to do that. Like, we got to win this race, and we don't have to make that choice if we make the correct choice in prioritizing what matters this year, and most years, in the gubernatorial candidate.
Steve, can you speak a little bit about the governor's council and how who wins the governor's race affects that?
So the question was the executive council races. There's 5 seats, most powerful seats that most people have never heard of. When I look at participation of voters, percent of people that walk into the booth that then participate in a given line on the ballot, there's always a drop at executive council, because there's some amount, 2 to 5% of people who go, I don't even know what that is. And so, if you don't know what it is, you can't really get mad at somebody for not being comfortable voting in it. And we find a consistent 2 to 5 point drop that then comes back up because people know what a state senator is, and so forth. Something that is very true, I don't know how I feel about it, but the data are the data. Even more than a state house candidate, the executive council nominees' fortunes are tethered so directly, almost one-to-one, to the performance of the gubernatorial candidate, that I have jokingly told executive council candidates who have asked for advice, I've said, raise as much money as you can, spend none of it, give it all to your favorite gubernatorial candidate, because that is going to be the best way to get the points for your race out of it. Every extra point the gubernatorial candidate gets in your district is virtually an additional point that you will get in your executive council race. And a big part of that is people don't really know much about what it is. They don't get to learn a lot about specific candidates. The most that I've seen an executive council nominee, I'll say in the post-Ray Burton era, Ray Burton was sort of his own thing, and some of you know that, is 2.5 points that I've seen a candidate overperform over what a model I have. It's called PICO. Won't get into it too much tonight. It figures out what a generic Democratic candidate would get given the macro factors, compares it to the actual candidate that ran, and that's basically the difference is PICO. And executive council candidates typically have PICOs that are almost identical to zero, because they're pretty much whatever the governor gets, that's what they get. which is tough. Most important race most folks don't think about.
But it makes them essentially a rubber stamp for the government.
At least electorally, right? Once they get in, if they exercise independence and all, that's a different policy, political thing. But in terms of, it's the ultimate in coattails. It is the ultimate in coattails. So something that folks that can access the charts, I won't go through every number on it because the pattern is virtually identical in every one of the 10 towns. But the pattern is this. In 2022, the gubernatorial nominee, I'm going to say Alexandria because it's alphabetically the first, very Republican town. So don't be alarmed by some of the numbers, please. The other towns get better. You know what? I'm not going to subject it to it. I'm going to pick Bristol. All right, and we're here, so you earned it. Okay, governor. This is the order of the ballot. This is the two-party result of the general election. Governor, about 36%. Okay, Sununu, incumbency, and he remains popular. I mean, it is what it is. And then, so 36, and then Hassan got 50, and then Custer got 51, and then Dana Hilliard got 45, and then our state Senate candidate got about 45.5, and then our state rep candidate got 40, and then Carolyn got 46.6. So what happens, and every town is pretty much the same thing. It just depends on how partisan it is, so where it starts. When you have a gubernatorial candidate that struggles, they get a low number. Then the two federal candidates, in this case, Senate and Congress, are next, and they get the same number. Maggie Hassan got 762 votes in Bristol. Annie Custer got 777. I can give you towns here where they got literally the same number. Because people in New Hampshire separate how they feel about the federal candidates from the state candidates. And because a lot of them don't know a lot about the down ballot candidates, if they don't know much about, Carolyn versus her Republican opponent last time, Sellers, who couldn't be more different if you know them. But when you go through the data, it becomes very clear. There's this not insignificant, because the voter participation rates are virtually identical. Pretty much, these are the same people. The same people are walking into the booth. They're like, I'll vote for Sununu. And then they're like, yeah, I'll definitely vote for Hassan and Custer. And then you lose about the halfway point between how they felt about governor and how they feel about the federal candidates. So it goes in Bristol from 36 to like 50.5 down to 44, 45. And that same pattern exists. In Enfield, it starts higher because it's so blue. In Alexandria, which I spared you from for now, it's just lower. It's the exact same pattern in virtually every town. But this is where the gubernatorial, this is going back, the gubernatorial number matters so much, because if that number wasn't 36, if it was 46, well, now all of a sudden, you can see direct correlation to how executive council, state senate, and state rep would go. You would gather a lot of that support back. Otherwise, we're asking executive council, state senate, and state rep to make up the ground. And you can be an outstanding candidate, but if we're asking you to make up, more than 5 points, 6 points, historically speaking, we're asking you to do, in most races, we're asking you to do too much. And so this is where we try to minimize that. And then if it's close enough, now this is where the work of raising the money, knocking on the doors, targeting voters with the right messages, you can make up 2, 3, 4, up to 5 points. But beyond that, you need the big factors to be at least good enough to allow the work getting done on the ground to take you successfully over the finish line. So in every one of these towns, so I want you to think about this in Bristol. So the highest vote getter among Democrats was Annie. She got 777, okay, 777. Carolyn got 703. The participation was virtually identical. Okay, so there were, not all, but there's a 74 vote difference there. Let's say half of it. I think it's probably more, but let's say half. 35 to 40 of those people voted for Andy, and then they voted for Sellers. One of 3 legislators out of 424 counting the Senate who sponsored a 15-day abortion ban, who is as Second Amendment without limits as anybody in the legislature. And the list goes on. I'm preaching to the choir on that. Carolyn's not, and it's not like, demographically, they're different gender, stylistic. I mean, this is so crystal clear, you couldn't have a bigger difference. And yet there are literally several dozen people in Bristol who said, I don't know. And what they're doing is they go, I don't know the candidates. So I'm going to go with either this guy, Sherman, who I probably never heard of, don't know anything about, for governor, or I'm going to go with Sununu, who has 62% approval rating at the time, and you fill in the blanks with the brand. So they go, probably Sellers is like Sununu. And he's not. Whatever you think of Sununu, we can agree on that. He's not that. I wish he was at least that, but he's not even that. But they don't know that. This is why the lowest hanging fruit in town after town for us begins with people that we know they're turning out, they showed up, and we know they're willing to vote for Democrats. They just did while they were in the booth. Now we just need them to close the sale all the way down the ballot. And if we get even 20 of the people, well, if we get 5 of the people in Bristol to do that, we're talking about a second term we're trying to shoot for here. And this is not even the biggest town in the district. The numbers are quite big in places like Enfield and elsewhere. So even in the most Democratic towns, we see this dynamic. And that to me is really where this goes. So I will, for the purpose, and I'm glad to go back in a moment to specific towns if you want at the end, just so that you get to it. But one thing I did that I had not done when we sat down last Thursday is I actually added the actual raw number of votes that each line ended up getting for the entire District 18. And it's pretty crazy. It's worth actually mentioning. So governor, put the 10 towns together, 3,481 votes, okay? A little under 3,500 votes for the governor, Democrat, is all Democrat, in the 10 towns of District 18. Hassan, 4,500 and change. Custer, about 4,700. So 4,693, that's the high point. That's the most Democratic votes of any line on the ballot. Executive Council, down to 4,200. State Senate, a little over 4,200. State House, the non-Flotarian, not Carolyn, the accumulation of the 3, 4,395, and then Carolyn got 4,225, which is literally the same number, 4,225, that the state Senate candidates got. Some of the district with the exact same, with the same household represented, which is not a coincidence, probably. If you have an opinion about one, then probably you've got a pretty similar opinion about both.
We act alike.
Right, you would think. I'm doing a 23 year, but it tells you like there were 470 votes in this entire District 18 between Annie and what Carolyn and the state Senate combined candidates got. 470 people. These races across New Hampshire are so close in so many places that starting with that, I mean, shame on us if we're not starting with people who are willing to show up and then willing to vote for Democrats, and then they just didn't know enough about down ballot to kind of go there. And we got to make sure that they don't think Kelly is like the fine default, the 5th term of Sununu or whatever. Like, because if they do, then we got a problem again. This is all connected. So that is, and then here's the last trend, and it's kind of the policy part that I really would like you to consider tonight and beyond. The third trend, there's a lot of time and money getting spent polling and researching to follow. High engagement voters versus low engagement voters. You may have seen some stories in the last few months about this. This is becoming kind of the new cleavage, the new split between voters, almost like the educational split. People that vote often or all the time, Biden is doing pretty well with them, and Democrats in general are. But the less engaged a voter you are, the more likely you are to vote Republican. For most of my activist lifetime, Democrats are the ones that said, there are more people out there that are Democrats. The problem is we have lower turnout numbers. So we need to come down the stretch and knock on every door, and we need to, if turnout is high, we win the election. And right now, that's not true. Right now, the bigger the turnout, the better it probably is for Trump, which creates all kinds of weird consequences, and it could change, but here's where I'm going with it. And I have, so if you voted in a 2022 primary, this is a New York Times Siena poll taken last month in the swing states, high quality poll. If you voted in a 2022 primary, state primary in your state, right now you're for Biden 49-44, okay? If you voted in the midterms, so the general election in 22, but you didn't vote in the primary, so you're involved, but not quite as into the game, it's 46-45. So it goes from a 5-point lead, and then the second most engaged is a 1-point lead. Then they go, what if you voted in the 2020, the presidential, which always has higher turnout, but you didn't vote in the midterm, nor the primaries, so a little less engaged. Trump, 44-42. And then if you have not voted in a recent election, Trump 49-35. And this is what Trump, at least for now, is banking on. If a lot of those people show up, and by the way, it does not cut by race or age, it does cut by socioeconomics, educational attainment, and income, which goes back to my first point earlier. The higher income attainment you have, income level, the more likely you are to be a high engagement voter, which, not coincidentally, right now means you're more likely to be voting Democrat. So the lower the turnout at the moment, the better it is for Biden. And the more people that don't usually vote that show up for now. So here's the big question. And a lot of these, I believe, are people that match this group of people. I'm trying to bring it all back together. So these hundreds of people that show up, they don't really know much about the difference between Carolyn and Sellers or Sununu, they don't know who Tom Sherman was. Like they're showing up, but they're not as engaged as people that did have an opinion about the candidates. Maybe they did read the mail, but this group I'm talking about did not look at the mail or whatever. So why is this happening? It is not that they're not paying attention. The polling shows it is because what they prioritize is radically different. High engagement Democrats prioritize very different things from low engagement Democrats. That's a really important point. High engagement Democrats, if I asked you to write down the 4 issues that you personally care the most about, and then I took 4 registered Democrats, so they're registered, and they don't usually vote, and I asked them to do the same exercise in a secret ballot way, I think you would be shocked how all these Democrats could come up with such different lists than what you came up with. So people, the ones that voted in the 22 primaries, then go down one, and the ones that never voted, okay? Like the highest and the lowest, the same groupings. They asked them in the poll, how do you view the economy? Highest engagement, 64% said good or excellent. The next one down, 34%. So it went from 64 to 34. The ones that voted in the presidential, but that's it, 21. And the ones that didn't vote in 20 or 22, 16% said the economy was good or excellent. 84% said it was fair or poor. So think about that. And I'm not putting it on the spot, but most folks who would show up at something like this tonight would say the economy is good or excellent about your personal economy. But 84% of people that didn't vote in 20 or 22 think it's fair or poor. So what do you think they prioritize? I'll tell you what they don't. These are Democratic-leaning voters. These are either registered Democrats or undeclared who self-describe as leaning Democrat. These are not Republicans I'm going to describe to you now. The ones that the highest engagement, they were asked, how many of you think abortion or democracy is your top issue? Either one. For the top tier, 42% said, yes, either democracy or abortion is my #1 issue this fall. Go down, 27%. Go down, 14%. Go down. These are Democrats and Democratic leaners who didn't vote in 20 or 22. only 14% say either abortion or democracy is the #1 issue. Why? Because that's the exact same group that 86% of them say the economy is fair or poor. So now we ask them, what is your #1 issue? And they say, inflation. How much is a dozen eggs? The economy, job, money, money. I cannot overstate this. Money, money, money. When you don't have it, or you're afraid you're about to lose what you have, it's really hard to think about climate change, or justice, or abortion, or democracy. When you feel relatively comfortable, you have the, if I may be so bold, luxury of being able to not have to sweat tomorrow out. And that means you can think a little more macro about it. And I'm not judging when I say that. Okay, my parents filed bankruptcy when I was in high school because my dad was self-employed. Housing, early 90s, tough time to be building homes. We got stuck with a house we couldn't sell. My dad dropped our insurance. About 3 months after we dropped the insurance, my mom at 39 years old had a heart attack. She survived, but it was an $80,000 medical bill from CMC Hospital in Manchester. And they called us 2-3 times a day, I remember. And they were calling, and they're like, if you're not a deadbeat, you would pay your bill. And they'd be like, if we had the money to pay the bill, we would have had insurance. I had my heart attack last summer at 49. I ran 5 marathons. I don't eat red meat pretty much. And I knew my mom's health. And I had a massive heart attack, the third of 3, that should have killed me last July. We had good insurance, so it only cost us $4,000. That's the difference. I'm able to think about abortion and democracy and climate change because my heart attack only cost us $4,000, and my mom's heart attack cost $80,000 in 1991. How much is that today? I'm not judging, and I would urge you, don't judge. In fact, if people feel like we're judging, we're losing. Okay, they're not looking for judgment; they're looking for answers. And whoever can give them answers, and frankly, it's not Trump. They're worried about inflation. But his policies would be to put in a new Fed chair who would listen to him and lower interest rates. It would be to put a tariff on everything coming into the country, which is basically the national sales tax. And it would be to cut top-end taxes, which would raise the deficit, which has an inflationary impact on monetary policy. His policies would increase inflation, but they're looking for hope, and they see somebody who says, I'm as mad as you are, and they go, that's a start. That's a start. So coincidentally, there's a woman, her name is Yana Krupnikov, and she is a professor at the University of Michigan. And she wrote a book a few years ago that is suddenly getting a lot more attention. It's called The Other Divide. And it was about high engagement versus low engagement. The research was done 3+ years ago. So she was ahead of her time. I wanted to read a couple of quotes because suddenly people want to know her opinion on a whole lot of things. She said, when we look at the issues that people who are less involved are sort of interested in, we see a pretty sizable divide on a lot of issue importance questions. This is not the same as saying that their views don't map on the left-right continuum. They still are taking issues that are along with at least their partisan affiliation. So it's not that these low engagement Democrats are against choice. It's just they're like, listen, man, I got real problems tomorrow I got to deal with. Are you going to help me fix my problems? I don't have money to pay the bills. So they're not on the wrong, what we would classify as the wrong side of the issue. It's prioritization, not a difference in the policy position. Then she says, what is different is the issues that they find really, really important. What is different is what they think are the things that politics and the government should be focused on and should be addressing. So where we see involvement mattering is not necessarily in how you line up, but what you think is important. And the last quote, we found an enormous divide within Democrats on the extent to which inflation was important. Democrats who were deeply involved, people that are here tonight, said that inflation was not that important compared to other issues, whereas uninvolved Democrats put it right at the top of their most important issues. In fact, what we found really surprising is that on a number of these economic issues, even when we re-interviewed people during the January 6th televised hearings, when democracy would have been, this coincidentally is when they were redoing some interviews. There was actually less division between uninvolved Democrats and Republicans than there was between uninvolved Democrats and involved Democrats, which is how Donald Trump can be leading a group that includes a lot of uninvolved Democrats, 49-35, and it's not because they think Trump is right on issues where Biden is wrong. It's because they think Trump is talking about issues that they think we're just not talking about enough. So it creates a quandary because probably the things that you care the most about, the things that animate you, that you think about, you talk to your friends about, that cause you to want to knock on a door, can kind of quantify it. That's kind of not what the people we most need to talk to want to talk about. They want to talk about, they want to talk about how much a dozen eggs are more than they want to talk about abortion rights, even though they agree with you on abortion rights. That's a really important message I want you to take away, because I believe strongly the kind of people that are going to go from Carolyn losing by 4 to winning by a comfortable margin are disproportionately, particularly in a presidential year, where we're going to have more voters and thus more low engagement voters that are going to come out for president, and then we don't know what their behavior will be as they trickle down the ballot. We need to communicate to that group of folks, many of whom will be on your list as registered Democrats, and communicate, go to where they are on the issues. And it appears where they are is on economic metrics, much more than, frankly, a lot of the stuff they could probably get emails about every day asking for money from candidates, if we're being honest. Yes?
Okay, I'm just so inspired. The economy's stupid once again.
Yep. Sort of, kind of.
But first of all, I just have to thank you so much for all you have done and all you do. And you know, the term Braveheart came to my mind as I was thinking about your struggles with heart conditions. So may you live long and prosper. But what I want to talk about, what I'm most concerned about as a lifelong educator, is the lack of involvement of youth. Last time when I was canvassing, probably the most disturbing conversations I had were with young people who had not registered to vote. And I said, when are you going to register to vote? And they said, why would I bother? Why should I bother to vote? What's in it for me? And of course, you go through all the reasons why they should be voting. So the second part of that is that I really think we need to be engaging in voter registration with young people. Now, we've already gotten into some conversations with the former principal at Newfound Regional, Michael Malley, who's willing to conduct a voter registration come September with the students. I think if we could just do this in the high schools and, you know, just do this as a kind of parental responsibility of engaging youth who are so disengaged, we can find ways to engage with them on the issues that they care about. But first, we've got to start talking to them. We've got to listen to them. We have to hear what is on their minds. After all, they are the future voters, but they're also the future of our party and our government.
So the comment, sort of question in there for those on Zoom, basically is engagement of and eventual registration and support from younger voters. And it is true that young voters don't participate at the same rates. One thing that I didn't include here, but that comes through on the research and the polling. So the recent polling and the research from a few years ago, young people do not, they sort out in the same way here. So the subset of young people who are heavily engaged are acting like heavily engaged Democrats and Republicans already. But low engagement young people, which happens to be a bigger percentage of that age cohort than other ages, nonetheless, they answer in the same way. So their concerns that would animate them to go from sidelines to in the game are economic, and they're looking for one of the two parties. So one of the things that's part of the study, if you think about the people that are undecided in general, they kind of fall into two buckets. One bucket are folks that feel like neither party is really connecting with them, and they're looking for the one that makes them a good fit, and they're honestly evaluating. Those are this is a relatively small group, frankly, of people that are high engagement relative to the second group, because they are actually thinking about, which do I like better? That's a level of engagement that suggests they would vote, they have voted, they're in the game, they're going to register. If you get to that point, you're already getting there. Then it's a persuasion discussion, which is a totally different exercise. The bigger bucket is this infrequent voter who is just trying to keep their head above water and is looking to see if either party can talk to them in the way that will connect. So they're not evaluating between two, they're looking for one. And so I think what the research shows is younger people that are not engaged, at least at this snapshot in history, are more likely to be motivated by hope for their economic future. Which a lot of them see as very bleak economically for their future. The part that's sort of interesting is because the boomers are the largest, up to that point, the largest generation in American history, and now about half of boomers have retired. We're now seeing a cascading of boomers retiring on a daily basis. There's a ton of jobs. Two big things are happening. A lot of jobs are getting emptied. And I'm from the smallest generation in American history relative to the ones around us, Gen X. If I see one more tweet or Facebook message from somebody that's like, I can't wait till we finally have a millennial president, I'm like, can we get one Gen X one? Can we do that? We're just gonna skip it? We're still doing silent generation. Can I get one? Let's just go to millennial. But we can't replace the exiting as fast. There aren't enough Gen Xers ready to move to upper management to replace the boomers. There just aren't enough of us. So it's creating these bubbles in the economy. The other thing, and this is a big deal that I don't hear either party talking about, boomers are now going from stuffing as much money as they can into investment, into the stock market, into the economy, into investment rather. And they are now slowing down and stopping, and they're going, I'm beginning to pull my money out of the investment class. And that's having a lot of monetary effects. I mean, it's the biggest amount of money ever put in by a group of humans in one generation of the history of the world that is now effectively stopped and is beginning to retreat back as people are pulling out in retirement. I don't care if you're Biden or Trump or anybody, these are bigger things than just like, a tax cut. I mean, these are enormous generational impacts that neither candidate really wants to address, in part because there's not a lot you can say about it. Like, no, it is what it is. And we've known it for 40 years when we saw how big the generation was. So yeah, anyway, for younger voters, they are not different in what motivates them. If they're not engaged, they're probably more worried about economic than they are about things that are really important, but just not in their world right now, like abortion, climate change, democracy.
Steve?
Yes.
I want to pull it back to the state level.
Of course.
The state basis. One of the things I know you and I have both seen over, I have a couple more years involved in politics because I am a voter. But one of the things that I think happens is people sort of read a poll and they get one idea, they get a fixed idea, and that's the magic bullet. And there are no magic bullets in politics, just like there are no magic bullets in life. Okay, it doesn't happen that you get one phrase or whatever. In this case, I do think that there are ways to talk about some of these issues that Steve just talked about, economic issues, but tie them to issues that we also care about. I'll give you two examples. One is public education and education freedom. I have seen consistently, and I come from Canaan, but I talk to a lot of folks who are on the red side of the ledger. And I have seen consistently that if you're talking to someone who is not particularly a supporter of public education, who doesn't have kids in the system, who's skeptically looking and misunderstanding the trends, the Hampshire is losing young people. We are getting older and older and older, and ultimately it's going to come back to kill us economically if we don't change that trend. But some people look at that and say, well, we're losing students, why are we spending more on education? Well, everything's getting more expensive. But the argument that I've used with those folks, and it's one that 4 times out of 5 works, and that is to say, here's the difference. When you spend money on public education, You know exactly where the money's going. You vote on that budget every year, and you can see it. When you give education freedom accounts, there is no accountability whatsoever. I can take my $6,000 and go to Fox News, and no one's going to say boo, no one's going to come back and check to see whether I educated my child. That is a killer argument, and it ties together public education and accountability and taxpayer responsibility and what are you doing with my dollars? I'm having a tough enough time over it. The second issue, and full transparency, this is what I've lobbied on this year. The state of New Hampshire, the way it does its business profits tax. If you're a mom and pop convenience store, or if you're Steve's dad and you've got your own carpentry business, you have to pay full freight on the business profits tax. Whatever the state says you owe, you pay that. If you're Amazon, you get a break. If you're a foreign-owned multinational corporation, you don't have to pay a dime. So we're advantaging, and the Republicans have supported this. It came up for a vote this year in January. I can give you, if you want it, I can give you the roll call. The Republicans, on a party line vote, voted to protect foreign multinationals from paying the business profits. Now, if that's not an economic issue that impacts everybody in this room and everybody in the state, I've never seen it. To me, those are two issues that we can tie economics and the issues that we care about, public education and fairness, and I think they're killer arguments.
In fact, along those lines, one issue that I haven't mentioned tonight, it comes up in the polling and the survey, but in a way different than you might think, is immigration. Very powerful issue, and that the Republicans in New Hampshire are trying to explicitly tie it via our northern border to sometimes they explicitly say it, and this is factually false, that it's somehow similar in the amount of activity between the southern border and the northern border. Now, my aunt's a retired dairy farmer in Pittsburgh, and the land is on the border, and I spent a lot of time up there on the border. So, a lot of times when it didn't rain for a while, you could do a little hop and get in Canada, and I mean that's how it is. And I will say there is increased activity compared to say 20 years ago. That is true. But then the next statement, so to be honest, then let's continue to be honest, and that number is it's extremely small compared to what they're implying is a southern border crisis. And so they're trying to tie the immigration issue somehow to it. To the extent that immigration comes up in this research and this polling, it is when candidates are able, in either party, to connect it to the economy. Specifically, when they can say, when immigrants come here and they're taking your job, and usually it's in an audience that implies a working class job, probably in the chance in the service industry, and they're taking your job and by doing so, depressing wages on the low end of the scale. And I'm going to fight. And so when a candidate can successfully make that connection, that does seem to resonate with the low engagement voter. But here, especially here in New Hampshire in the down ballot races, don't be surprised if down ballot candidates try to find ways to affix a potential hot button issue to their advantage for a state rep, state senate, executive council race. And we need to be prepared to push back on that because they're trying to implicitly, sometimes explicitly, connect them. On the education issue, Tom, right, so good, is I used to audit state and local governments for a living. And New Hampshire, when I would go around the country and I would tell other auditors at conferences and stuff, they said, where are you from? I'm from New Hampshire. And they'd be like, oh, that's great. When we want to know what governance looked like in the 19th century, we come to New Hampshire today. That's where we do the research and see this kind of living history. And what they mean by that is we are the most inefficiently run state in America structurally. So we've lost, Tom made the point, we've lost almost 25% of our K-12 student population in this century. It's like 23%. Some of it's demographics, People are waiting longer to have kids. This is where the high cost of housing is a contributing factor. There's a lot of factors. A lot of them are demographic in nature. Think about this, 23% fewer kids than in the year 2000. More than 10% more SAUs than the year 2000. So we have increased the administrative structure at the same time that we've seen a collapse in the number of school-age kids. And so what does that mean? It means we now have the second highest administrative cost per pupil in America. And it's not because of bloat and waste and fraud and abuse, which is what they say. It's not it at all. It's because of math, which I want us to be the party of math, because that's kind of part of how you figure stuff out. And so with the math, the reality is that if you have fewer kids, you still got to plow, you still got to have a principal, you still got to heat the building. You get the idea. So when they take the Freedom account there, the voucher program, and they pull out the money, it is remarkable. Supporters, almost exclusively Republicans, have found a way to take the most inefficient delivery system for education in America, New Hampshire, and make it more inefficient by, in effect, making every household its own SAU. It is somehow making it more inefficient with way less transparency and accountability so that you kind of figure out if the money's actually being used for education. Because if they pull X out, they divide the amount of spending by the number of kids, and they say your kid left, you get that money. But of course, it's not how it works, because there's still costs. You don't get rid of a teacher every time a kid leaves. You would need a wave of change to happen in order to make structural change. You still have a superintendent. You're just throwing that cost out to fewer kids, and it's a killer. So it's taking the most inefficient delivery system in America, it's making it more inefficient with less accountability, less transparency. If you want to get the 80% of New Hampshire households who don't have a school-age kid, 80%, to be into this issue, the faster you turn it into their, and I'm not being a jerk when I say this, their economic self-interest, the faster you earn a vote, and do it with authenticity and truth. The number one driver of that person's home value is what? The quality of the school district. If people perceive that that house is in a great school district, I used to work in this stuff. 2 houses across the street from each other in Portsmouth when I was mayor. Same house, same number of square feet, the whole shebang. The school district line for the elementary school was the center line of the street. Those 2 houses, 15% difference in the property value if it was in that school district versus the one perceived as not as good. That's your number one investment, most people, your home. That's what we're talking about. When we denigrate the local public school, we're not just hurting the kids, that's bad enough. We're actually hurting your property value, brother. And what we're talking about in that, remember, most people don't have a kid in schools right now. To get anything passed of education at town meeting day is a miracle. We're asking 30+% of people in your town who don't have kids in the schools to fund for the betterment of the community. It's remarkable anything gets passed. I don't want to rely on miracles, so give them the numbers as well. Anyway, it is 8:30.
We do it in the name of freedom.
So I'll take some questions. That's it for slides, but let's go. Yeah, please, yes.
So what you haven't addressed is the distribution of voting across independents. You've identified Republicans and Democrats. You've identified the stratification within each of the parties, but you've not done that for independents, and that's 33% of the vote.
So these numbers reflect, in all the different slides, they reflect the behavior. So it absorbs the independents, the overwhelming majority of whom are generally Democrats or Republicans behaviorally, but for a variety of reasons like to maintain their undeclared status in New Hampshire. We have more of that than most states. We're one of the highest, plurality of the state is undeclared, but most of them are actually Republican or Democrat in their behavior. So all of those absorb it into the numbers. And once people go down the road of voting Democrat or Republican several times in a primary or a general election, they functionally become that party, even if their label remains undeclared. So that's sort of the quick answer to that. So it absorbs where the undeclareds, how they act in each of these towns and districts.
I would comment that the stratification within the independents is not as marked as it is in either of the parties.
That's probably true, although I think that there is stratification, but it's not, I think your intuition makes sense that if somebody who is a registered Democrat is more likely to be a stratified Democrat than somebody who's an undeclared who generally votes Democrat. But one of the things that we're seeing an increase in, and research really shows, and I think it's alarming, is that it's true of both parties, but more with the Democrats, that low engagement, infrequent voting Democrats are so different in how they see the priorities over high engagement Democrats. There's much bigger delta than the Republican equivalent. And you see it in the so where Republicans get in trouble is at the high engagement level, is when they do, and I'm not equating them spiritually, but like their equivalent of talking about abortion all the time, sometimes is talking about abortion all the time. But on the pro-life side, which it's even more polarizing because it's generally a less popular position than the pro-choice position, but they're living in a bubble where everybody at the local, pick your local committee Republican meeting is further to the right on abortion than even the median Republican, like just Joe Republican hanging out at home, who is they're ambivalent. They're not thinking about it a lot. What are they thinking about? They're also thinking about the economy all the time. So when they're talking about the trans issue, like Republicans will bang the drum on that all day, but what they're not seeing is that with low engagement Republicans who are worried about how much a dozen eggs are, they're way more worried about the cost of groceries than they are about whether or not, what the policies are for trans kids in New Hampshire. It's not something they're even thinking about. Right. Thank you. A UNH poll came out last week, showed 1% of the voters polled said the most important issue was abortion. 36% said it was housing. Like when people tell you who they are, you gotta listen to them. 36% said the number one issue was the lack of affordable housing. That is an economic issue. Like the winning is, and the good news is, I think that we're capable of having great policy positions that are also winning positions on the issues that people are screaming at us, they want us to fix. And that's what we need to focus on. I saw a few hands, yes.
I'm concerned about what we're going to do as a committee. It sounds like you said governor's race is so important in terms of how people vote. That's going to go down and affect our local races. But one of the problems is we don't have the primaries not until September. So those of us who haven't decided, okay, September, now who's your candidate? So you only have a couple of months before the election. So that's tough. But it sounds like we should be focusing on getting people to think about and vote in that primary and be focused on that person then that will help our candidates.
So certainly one of the most important jobs for activists that are engaged at this point, early on and really into it, is our role in the gubernatorial nomination process. So I believe this week, for example, the Plymouth area Democrats, Wednesday night are having both candidates. I don't know the format.
Actually, all three candidates.
I'm sorry, all three candidates. I didn't mean to do that. Yeah. Are they doing back-to-back? Is it three people and more of an actual?
I think it's going to be all three people together. They're each going to have opening statements, and then I think there's going to be a Q&A. It's not a debate per se, but it's more like the candidates tonight that we're all used to. All the three candidates will say something, and then everybody gets asked questions.
So all of you here are remarkably important in the process. The sensitivity that gubernatorial candidates have towards how you see the world, what you think matters, how you will decide your vote for governor, because it's low turnout, every vote quite literally mathematically matters more. And I can tell you, I'm sure both candidates get frustrated that it's surgical, and it's very expensive and time intensive to try to do the surgery, to talk to the people in a community who actually are going to vote in my primary, on September. It's so late, and then you have to turn the ship around the next day. And, so what you can do, and I know I've been there, is anytime you get a chance, go talk to, if they're showing up at a local committee, go, if it's a couple towns away, go, and there's going to be Q&A opportunity. Grab them before or after an event, like something at Plymouth. If there's not an opportunity to get your hand up and ask during the event, grab them before or after and sing in unison every time until you're blue in the face. Tell me why you are the best candidate to take on and defeat Kelly Ayotte in November. And what's going to happen, because I've seen it, is they likely will both very quickly fall, like all candidates do, into an auto answer, right? And so they will quickly either gently denigrate their opponent and basically answer the question more like, that's why they're not the one, which is not nothing, but not really what you asked. Or they're going to say things that frankly are not tangible. They're not relevant to what you asked. Like, and I don't think it's obvious which one is the right answer, to be honest with you. But if they keep hearing it, that's the only thing that people are asking them. Give me an honest, what is your strategy for defeating Kelly Ayotte? And then if they don't give you an answer, politely interrupt them and say, hey, that's great. They're going to say, look, I'm the strongest on abortion rights. Really? Like, are either of them really better on abortion rights than the other? Really? I think that's silly. They're both very strong on it. And both will appear identical in the general election relative to Kelly. So I don't want to know why you're good on abortion rights, because that's not a differentiator. Tell me how in the general election you're going to go and get it. And that's it. And if we all keep doing that every time, eventually they realize that is the only thing that really matters right now. Yes.
Well, I appreciate what Tom said about the education, the freedom accounts that undermine your value of your house. But the other part of that, maybe it's really quite related, is that Republicans who have a stereotyped view are fiscally conservative, supposedly, and be that as it may. But when part of fiscal conservatism means accountability, and when money in a freedom account just goes into a black hole, I think this is another compelling argument to address the economics and how it's really costly to have the freedom account. I have a bias. I'm a public educator for 50 years. So anyway, that's one point. The other, for those people who don't know who I am, I'm Richard Loban, and I'm running, this is my wife Carol, who ran for District 18, as we heard repeatedly. I'm running for District 10, which is the district just for Bristol and Bridgewater. And it may be a surprise, as it was to both of us, but the bête noire of Bristol, namely John Sellers, I'll be running against him, and she will not be running against him. And so the question to you, to what extent, even though we had 42% equal, I ran for 22 towns, and she only ran for 10. But the question, to what extent is Sellers a asset or liability? To what extent whoever runs against him, he's quite widely despised because of his extremist views on education and other things. So that's the question that anybody might know. I mean, what's the Sellers?
So I'll repeat it for folks listening. So Sellers, and I'm sorry, I just blanked his first name again. John, thank you. John Sellers is the incumbent in 18 who won by 4 votes, who is now not running again in 18, but is instead running against Richard, Carolyn's husband, in 10, which is Bristol and Bridgewater only. So there are 3 House districts within 18. 18 is kind of the umbrella. 10 is one of them, and it's 2 of the 10 towns, Bristol and Bridgewater. Bristol moving quickly in a Democratic direction So we had some really good headway there in 2022. So Sellers is now running in 10. Now, as I said earlier, for folks that don't know, there were only two House members. Eventually, one started and then said she made a mistake and misread it, but whatever. I'll give the benefit of the doubt. 2 House members and 1 state senator were the co-sponsors of a 15-day abortion ban. True story, true story. About 3 months ago, a couple of Republican friends of mine, very active Republicans on the seacoast, pretty moderate, and especially by the standards of today's party, definitely not MAGA Republican type. And they were like, do you know who the Sellers guy is? This is, 90-minute drive away from Sellers. And I'm like, oh yeah. And they're like, this 15-day abortion ban is giving all of us Republicans a bad name. They're like, we're both pro-choice. Like, what's going on here? And they're like, is he going to get primaried? Because we would totally support whoever's running against him. And of course, the funky thing about New Hampshire is you can not move and still live in your same house, and then just decide you're going to run in a different House district, and it's perfectly normal in a lot of the state, which is what happened. He moved into a somewhat more Republican district, which I suspect is part of his. I think he knows he would be in political deep situation if he ran again in a district that is an R+1 and moving quickly towards Democrats. That his brand just is a wild mismatch for a district that looks like that. So he goes, okay, I'm going to move to a more Republican district where I have a better chance of surviving. I don't know this, but I presume that's what's going on. Oh, I know that. I'm saying that he doesn't have to move to switch his district.
Because he won by a large margin in Bristol.
Oh yeah. I'm sorry. I misspoke. In most of the country, you would have to like leave your house and move somewhere else if you wanted a better district. He didn't have to leave his house. He could just say, "I'm going to go from the float, which is an R+1, to the non-float, which is about an R+7-ish, I think." And by definition, he starts with a better chance because just rhetoric. It's fewer towns. It doesn't have Enfield all of a sudden. It doesn't have to deal with Canaan now, and so it's rhetoric. Even though, again, Bristol in particular is one of the more interesting towns in this neck of the woods in terms of how quickly it's moving towards Democrats, which is great. It's not blue yet, but it's getting less red quickly. And I haven't talked to him obviously about it, but I presume that is the math behind it. Look, there are a lot of Republicans who would disagree with him on some important issues, including the extent of his gun positions and abortion and other things. I will go back to, we're going to have to take on a guy in a district like that. You're going to have to do at least two things at once. You have to simultaneously communicate to Republicans who think that he's just too much. At the same time, and those are pretty high information. Those are Nikki Haley, it's the 20% of Republicans who would be very uncomfortable with him. And then there's this different audience of low engagement. A lot of them are Democrats, again, like we said earlier tonight, who, if they don't know anything about him, and if they think Kelly is a relatively moderate Republican, are going to fill in the blank like they did 2 years ago. Some of them are going to be the exact same voters, right? And they need to know his positions. And at the same time, these low engagement are probably more worried about economic issues. So you're going to have to inform them. That'll help you with the 20% that are kind of in Haley type. At the same time, you have to go to low information and connect with them on the economic level. Two different messages, not inconsistent with each other, two different audiences. In the district's redder, you have to go grab more people like that.
I believe, I'm not absolutely sure about the facts, but he gets 4,000 or 5,000 per child, and he has a very large family. So he gets a substantial amount of money from state taxpayers just for miseducating, his children. I think for that issue to resonate, I think what Tom said earlier is sort of the magic path there. It's connecting to assuming that's true, that if he is tapping into multiple kids worth of voucher program money, and you can connect that to, here's Mr. Fiscal
responsibility, Mr. Fiscal Conservatism, who is grabbing thousands and thousands of dollars of effectively local taxpayer money, in effect, and you don't even get to find out what he did with it. That's not your grandfather's Republican Party right there. Even Mitt Romney would be like, I don't know. Yep. Okay, sorry.
I just wanted to point out that I think John Sellers won the election last time because of doing things like going to Old Home Day with a large table, greeting everybody, and lying about what he thought. Basically, he said, his basic thing he said over and over and over was, we need to get along. We, the Republicans and Democrats, have to work together. And he said that 1,000 times as all these people went through in front of his booth. And being there, talking, meeting everyone, he got to talk to all the low engagement people.
We noticed that, and our candidates will be in the parade, and we will be at Old Home Day. Because I think you're right, they have a very big presence, so sign up for the thing.
You had the money for the tent.
But they got,
You didn't have the money.
he had people in front of his table all the time.
And also, he was very engaged with writing letters to the
Oh,
Laconia Daily
gosh,
Sun,
yes.
et cetera.
Oh,
So I
yes.
think part of it was name recognition. If they didn't know anything about either person, they saw the name of John Sellers, whether they read his letters or not. And obviously, his letters have become a lot more extreme than it was several years ago. But at the same point, I think part of it was name recognition. So just like all the various Old Home Days or any, for example, also the farmers markets. There's lots of opportunities to be there where there's lots of people.
And if he was using rhetoric like, we need to get along, we need to go across party, that sort of thing, that would be consistent when somebody shows up at the voting booth and they go, I don't know a whole lot about either of them. That may be the one thing they know about him is that brief interaction. But he said something that rhymes with Sununu's kind of like, he looks like the dude next door who, in Bedford, I mean, he looks like a classic suburban neighbor. And that's his vibe, right? And if when in doubt, you go with your gubernatorial brand. And if we don't have a brand, and we've not really had a brand in a while, certainly since Hassan, Lynch provided a pretty dominant brand when he was governor. He also was in 75% of the vote in 2006 and 2008, and those were the biggest majorities we've ever had in the state house. And those are directly related, 100% related, because people that didn't know much about the candidates down ballot said, John Lynch is a guy who totally has his act together, nice guy, he shows up for everything, clearly a smart guy, and if it's good, that's probably what the House candidate is. It's been a while since we've had a brand that we've been able to lean on. And this is part of why, it's part of what I would want to hear Cindy and Joyce, hearing all the time is like, don't just think about how do I win 52-48 in this primary by sort of focusing on, what's a Warmington Democrat going to mean for the next decade? What's a Craig Democrat going to mean for the next decade? That's the kind of branding that I think we need that gives candidates down ballot tremendous wind in the back. And I know we probably have to get going. So anyway, thanks very much. Appreciate it.